Good afternoon and a very big welcome to our special webinar. For those of you that are new to our webinars, we are Jones Chase, a firm of specialist employment lawyers, and we act for a number of companies from PLCs all the way through to startups, and we also act for some fantastic individuals as well. And we're proud to say that we have a very high success rate of those that we represent. So the focus for today's webinar is grief and the impact of this in the workplace. We're delighted to be joined by our guest speaker, Lizzie Pickering, who's an expert and offers guidance to individuals and companies on dealing with the effects of grief. We also have one of the firm's partners, Susanna Rynehart, who's going to speak to you about prolonged grief disorder. And we also have Dominic Lyons, who became a qualified solicitor with Jones Chase this week. Congratulations, Dominic, who's going to speak to you briefly about the relevant laws that may apply when dealing with grief in the workplace. This is the shortest introduction I'm doing ever, so there's a lot to get through. In terms of format for the webinar, if you want to ask us any questions, please use the Q&A box and hit the anonymous button if you want to do anonymously. We are recording the webinar to allow other people to see it that couldn't make the live webinar, so please bear that in mind and hit the anonymous button if you want your questions to be anonymous. And lastly, I should emphasize that the points that we're covering today are not formal legal advice, but if you need any help with anything, do drop us a line. And a quick reminder that the law that we're covering today is accurate as of 12 o'clock on the 3rd of October 2024. So without further ado, moving very quickly on to Dominic, who's going to briefly explain the law that applies when dealing with somebody who's suffering from grief. Over to you, Dom.
Thanks, Dean. And as mentioned, I'm just going to kind of go through a whistle-stop tour on what legal provisions are in place that could possibly assist individuals dealing with grief in the workplace. There are 7 total that I'm going to discuss today. The first of which is statutory parental bereavement leave. Now, this applies in limited circumstances and it's only available to employees, but it applies to parents on the death of a child under 18 or a stillbirth after 24 weeks of pregnancy, which is the first limitation there, as parents will still experience grief for a stillbirth prior to 24 weeks, of course. It's a maximum of 2 weeks leave, and statutory parental bereavement pay is currently paid at £184.03 per week, or 90% of your average weekly earnings, whichever is lower. The second one I wanted to discuss is time off for dependents. As an employee, you're allowed reasonable time off to deal with an emergency involving a dependent, and a dependent can be a spouse, partner, child, grandchild, parent, or someone who depends on you for care. What is reasonable will depend on the individual circumstances, but it can be limited to as little as 1 or 2 days leave. Ultimately, this period of leave will be unpaid unless the employer agrees to pay an additional amount. The third one I wanted to discuss is carers leave. Now, I know it's a grief at workplace webinar, it's not entirely designed for grief, but you can get up to 1 week per annum unpaid, specifically to care for a dependent, which can be a husband, wife, civil partner or partner, child, a parent, a person who lives in your household, a person who relies on you for care, such as an elderly neighbour. But once again, this is unpaid leave unless the employer decides otherwise and decides to pay extra. The fourth one I wanted to look at was compassionate leave. Now, this is non-statutory and thus there is no legal right for a member of staff to be granted compassionate leave whilst at work. Some companies do have a standalone policy for this, but it may just offer as little as 2 to 3 days leave, and that may also be unpaid. If there is a policy, it's usually in place for all members of staff who are suffering from traumatic personal experiences, such as the death of a close relative or where a close relative has a life-threatening illness. Looking at some alternative options now, this is essentially other options outside of those statutory provisions and non-statutory provisions. Now, there is the option for companies offering discretionary unpaid or paid leave, where an employee is dealing with grief and where there's no sort of compassionate leave policy in place to deal with their issue of grief. But as mentioned, individuals do not have a legal right to this. There's also annual leave, where employees and workers can take annual leave when they are dealing with grief, with the statutory minimum for full-time employees being 28 days inclusive of bank holidays. Of course, it does not apply to self-employed individuals, but also dealing with grief is such a difficult time for an employee or worker ultimately they may not want to use their annual leave for these purposes. The last option, the seventh final option I want to discuss is sick leave. It's an option for helping employees dealing with grief in the workplace, but this may only be paid at statutory sick pay rate, which is currently £116.75 per week for up to 28 weeks. And that is, of course, difficult for a lot of employees with existing bills and mortgages that will need paying. Some employers do have a company sick pay they offer on a commercial basis, and that goes above and beyond statutory sick pay, but there's no legal right to this additional payment where there's no agreement in place. So that whistle-stop tour kind of does show you the legal provision for dealing with grief is centered around time off from the workplace, rather than dealing with grief through counselling or other assistance at work, which I know is going to be discussed later in the webinar. And as I've mentioned, it largely applies to employees unless the employer chooses to expand this. And lastly, for a lot of the provisions, unless the employer chooses to commercially pay more money, a lot of the employees cannot afford the lack of salary that will be afforded to this time off. And thus they are disencouraged to take the time off and are pressured into remaining in the workplace and not dealing with the grief itself. I won't discuss this in detail, as I know Susanna's going talking about this in a bit more depth, but there are various other circumstances under which an individual may suffer from grief, such as through a divorce, loss of a pet, or a long-term partner, which is not covered under these statutory provisions. And ultimately, my view and our view is that the statutory protection offered to individuals for dealing with grief in the workplace is currently inadequate. And that's all from me. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Dom. And yeah, when we were preparing for this webinar, we were looking at the law, and I didn't really realize how little statutory protection there is. And even it applies in very limited circumstances. You know, for example, the parental bereavement leave you have to have a parent, there must be a bereavement. And even that then is only a maximum of 2 weeks and paid at the statutory rate, which are actually quite low. Beyond that, you get time off for dependents, which is 1 to 2 days for emergency purposes. And then everything else isn't really on point as such. And it all comes from this in different strands of law. And the majority relies on the employer essentially being generous. And culturally, a lot of companies offer 2 to 3 days compassionate leave. It can be unpaid. So on the whole, yeah, maybe there's a bit of work to be done here. But thanks, Dom. If anybody has any questions about the legal underlying aspects of this, do drop us a line, info@joneschase.com, and then we'll get back to you any questions. Moving quickly on to our guest speaker, we're delighted to have you with us, Lizzie. We met at the Modern Woman Show in 2024 when you spoke fantastically about managing grief in the well, just generally then, and now specifically today we're delighted to have you with us to discuss managing grief within the working environment or the workplace. So without further ado, you're on mute at the moment, just to let you know. But could you tell us a little bit more about the fantastic work that you do?
Oh, thanks, Dean. Yes, well, it's great to be here, and it's great that you're having this conversation as an organisation. I'm so happy you're doing it. So yes, I help people back to work after major life changes, and especially bereavement. And I work with corporates, with law firms, with hospitals, with schools and mental health organisations to really provide better grief provision for their staff.
Fantastic. And I know this wasn't the job that you initially were doing, but what is it that brought you to this line of work?
Well, I suppose it was 24 years ago. I went through a major bereavement. My son, Harry, died. I was his carer for a few years. I'd originally worked in TV production and the news. So I went from a very sort of, loving my career and loving my work to suddenly being a carer to a very ill child, having 3 children under the age of 4. So life changed very dramatically overnight with the diagnosis, which was for me the first point of grief, that anticipatory grief. And after my son died when he was 6.5, I started working for the Children's Hospice where he died and where we'd had incredible respite care. And I was working very closely. I was working fundraising, but working very closely with bereaved parents through the bereavement team. And I was hearing so many awful stories about them needing to go back to work, having to go back to work, and the way they were being treated as bereaved parents. You know, they really were met by silence on the whole when they went back to work. And I find that actually, I mean, now the work I do is a mix of public speaking, educating, podcasts, films, all sorts of different avenues around the subject of grief. And now in speaking to hundreds of people, literally, because I also do one-to-one support, what I've realized, and I went through it myself, is that actually most bereaved people want to go back to work. They have to financially. They want to go back to work for that sense of community, purpose, a structure to sort of hang their broken lives back on in those early days. And you know, I think there's thought in a lot of companies that people won't want to go back to work, but actually work is a place of familiarity and that sense of old normal. But then when they get back, they're met with this silence because there isn't always good grief education in organizations to prepare staff to support each other. And actually, if we can put that in place, with peer-to-peer support and colleagues being well educated all the way through the company, then there isn't such an issue. And there's a real sense of loyalty to the company if they've had good grief provision. So it's not opening a can of worms, which is an expression I hear quite a lot, you know, through worried management, that they're in offering too much, that it's going to, you know, be a sort of tsunami of grief entering the company. It's not like that at all. There's a sense of loyalty to the company when there's good grief provision. And some of my clients that come to me for one-to-one support, when they come individually, if they're coming to me paid for by their company, they're well provided for, so they're loyal. But the ones I see that are paying for themselves to come individually have often left their companies because of the silence and the way they were treated, and they go to other companies. So companies are losing their best people just because they go through a bereavement, and I see that over and over again.
Yeah, and as you say, with a little bit of help, because you've mentioned to me previously, well, maybe we'll jump onto this now, but from your experience, you told me that people don't need that much support. And how many sessions do you normally do with a person, for example, if you're helping them?
Well, a lot of companies I work with will offer 3 sessions, because my grief provision is more like coaching. It's something I've developed myself. And, you know, it was through a realization that, I mean, therapy is wonderful and it's very good. And, you know, I've had therapy myself to help me through grief. But actually in the first year, I didn't want therapy. What I wanted to know was, how do we survive grief? How do I literally put one foot in front of another when the rug's been pulled? And so the work I do is more like coaching, and they're 1-hour sessions with a detailed follow-up. And so actually 3 sessions is often enough over some months, because I always say to the client, you let me know when you like another session, under the umbrella of what the company have organized. And then if they want more, I'll go back to the head of HR with their permission and full confidentiality and say, would you be happy to provide another couple of sessions or whatever's needed? And so we plan it together. We literally walk beside them. And often that's enough. It really is. Obviously there are exceptions, but it's, you know, it's not a huge amount.
I think that's great, because going from as you say, the normal position from your experience is just complete silence in the workplace, which leads to people feeling very isolated, vulnerable, upset, and then they leave before the employers had a chance to do anything. And then maybe there's a significant lack of understanding out there, as you said. And when I spoke to you, you know, I didn't know myself, but when you said to me, oh, people just need a couple of sessions. So the financial commitment on the part of a company, if they're sponsoring your services, for example, is very minimal. But the effect it has, and I've seen this sort of firsthand as well with the clients that we work with and elsewhere, that if you support somebody who's suffering from grief, or having a difficult time, with the right support, you can, from a business perspective as well, you can really shorten that grieving period, or the period of not being functional as such, so you can get people back to work as quickly as possible. And it just really does shorten that period. And maybe I was thinking it would be 10 to 20 sessions, but if your average is 2 to 3, yeah, it just makes a lot of sense for, I think the employers to be thinking about this as well. And just on that, and again, we discussed this prior to the webinar, but there's a common misconception out there. Maybe grief is purely associated with bereavement, or maybe, that's how we think of it as employment laws, where you need compassionate leave if there's the death of somebody very close to you. But what's your experience of grief, and does it have a wider meaning, would you say?
Absolutely, yes. So I work with people, some of the companies I work with provide grief provision for death, diagnosis, and divorce or significant breakup, and workplace change. So often, I'm working with all those aspects of grief, because it's any situation where your whole landscape has changed. You as an individual have your sort of inner sanctum around you of people, which could include work colleagues, friends, family. And if you remove any one of those significant people from your circle, it can change everything. The ripple effects affect every part of your life, including your work. You may have had to move home because of a divorce. Your friendship group may have changed. There are so many aspects, so many ripple effects. And migration obviously is another one. Even being sent to work in a different country can be a huge life change, where you're having to adapt to that massive change. So that my grief work actually extends to loss and change in all those different situations. And actually I developed it in that way because I went to speak on bereavement to an investment bank a few years ago. And afterwards, there weren't many questions during the session, and there was quite a lot of silence at the end. And I could tell they were very affected by the talk. And actually at the end, they all queued up to talk afterwards, didn't want to say it publicly. And it was about 90% men in the audience at the time. And they all wanted to talk about their divorces. So many of them had been through terrible breakups where they were dislodged from their normal in their outside lives, and nobody at work was talking to them about it. And yet they felt they had been through a catastrophic loss of identity, really, of everything they knew. And so they needed support.
Well, yeah, it's I guess again that's possibly misunderstood by many within in the workplace as well. Yeah, so it's such a huge change. It's the loss. A divorce can be the loss of your identity, and where you live, how you interact with people, and just it's such a huge life change. And yeah, people do react to that, more substantially than you may initially realize, But yeah, it's really interesting that people came to chat to you about that. Well, and I talk about bereavement because I guess it can be quite similar, if I could say that. And then when something happens to somebody and they are suffering from grief, how does that kind of play out in their day-to-day life? So how might grief affect somebody?
Gosh, in so many ways. I think firstly, because there's such a taboo about and a fear of talking about it, the language around grief, they can go back to work and be high performance mask wearers. They immediately put on the mask to manage to get through their working day. And I think there's a great fear about making somebody cry. I hear that a lot. I'm worried that I'm going to make them cry. We're not going to make them cry. We're going to hopefully offer them a safe space to talk by checking in on them regularly and seeing how they're doing on any given day. And actually, when you do, and if they do have a cry, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, because there are a lot of physical effects of grief. And the more we hold it in our bodies, the worse that can be. It's going to come back and bite us eventually. And for some people, that could be decades on. And if we think about the Second World War and the silences, there was that expression, don't mention the war. And it was to the soldiers, don't mention what you've witnessed. And to the people they were coming back to, don't ask them any questions. And I do believe that a lot of those ripple effects of silence we're still dealing with now. We're just beginning to unearth them in this generation.
Wow.
So the physical effects, the lungs, the gut, I see a lot of my clients are on things like omeprazole and Gaviscon for gut issues, when actually it's grief they're going through, the gut reaction. Heart issues. I spoke to a heart consultant who's an imaging specialist, and she was seeing a lot of people turning up for heart scans, and actually they had healthy hearts. What they were suffering from was heartbreak. And there's when you have a partner or a child die, somebody really significant in your life, there's a much higher percentage chance of having a heart attack in the month after somebody's died than at any other time. So this is real, but then beyond that, people can suffer panic attacks. And part of those panic attacks are because they're holding it all in order to mask wear, to go back to work, to be socially acceptable, to kind of counteract the silences they're getting from friends, even from family sometimes. You know, my clients tell me that they're from very close families, but that through grief, it sort of slightly fractured the family because they're all grieving differently and they're not understanding each other. And therefore, they can even be mask wearing at home in some way to protect, they all protect each other, or they lash out. So there are so many multiple ways that grief can affect you. And if if you're going back to work because you need to financially and you want to for structure and purpose, you want that to be a safe place where you have the support in place. And, Dean, it's not rocket science, this support. The sort of things I put in place with companies are, firstly, having a good intranet and a separate place for grief, so that when somebody's bereaved, they can go straight to the intranet, not necessarily look under the mental health banner, but go straight to a grief provision part of the intranet. And on there, you would hope to see some good grief guidelines on how they can access support and who they need to go to for their point of contact, either through their line manager or directly to HR with full confidentiality. You would hope that if they've had some speakers in speaking on grief, some podcasts, some grief education talks, that those might be there recorded, or like our session today, on their intranet. But they need to see a welcoming space that isn't frightening, that's very clear with its provision. And then that way they will access the support without fear. Because a lot of my clients also tell me they're scared of losing their jobs. And these are the ones where there isn't good grief provision. If the provision is there and it's evident and clear, then they're okay and they know what to do and they get the support. And then that's why I'm often talking to them. But it's the ones that come to me individually, paying for themselves privately, where there's been very little provision, as Dominic made very clear, in what the sort of legal provision is. I mean, I had one mother whose daughter, aged 22, had died, and she was given 2 days off work and expected to go on. I had somebody, I mean, I've got numerous stories, but somebody else where I was giving a talk, she'd had a miscarriage, a really, really horrendous miscarriage, and her line manager had asked her to finish the work before going to hospital. On a Sunday, she'd phoned in on a Sunday and was asked to sort of finish some tasks before she went so that they could manage during the week. I mean, there are numerous stories, but it's unforgivable. And that line manager obviously he was very awkward and unsettled, and he needed good grief training. So that's something else I do, is set up grief training for HR teams and management. The talks, the podcasts, we need all these sort of avenues to access the help. So it's clear, it's talked about, and it's not a fear for anyone.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess this is the part of the webinar where we can talk about, as you already have done, things employers can do. Susanna, Dom, feel free to chip in as well. Some of the things that we see with our clients when we're doing employment law work is where somebody has the traumatic event, they kind of bottle everything up, come back to work, do their best for maybe a few weeks, a couple of months even, and then all of a sudden just have a complete breakdown. and then they are out of the office for significant periods of time. And then it's treated as a sort of long-term sickness issue. There's, for the larger companies, maybe more of a legal process is followed. Whereas some of the things that we've discussed prior to the webinar, Lizzie, for example, that could be part of this grief package. One of the things we're sort of toying with the idea at Jones Chase is working with our clients to create a grief at work policy. So all these things can be in there. It will be different for each company. Each employer wants to take a different approach, but some of the things that can be in there, for example, are allocating somebody to have a grief ally. This is your idea, Lizzie. You mentioned it before. Somebody who will help to get that person integrated back into the workplace, maybe go for lunch, take them for coffee, just talk to them, allow them to, express their feelings and emotions in a safe place. And having these things in place can then avoid that future kind of breakdown, which will result in time out of work. Any other ideas that anyone else would like to table for the grief provision?
I think one thing it's really, on that note, is really important to understand is that grief is for life. So after the first year, they're not going to be better. They're going to be adapting incrementally and slowly to living with grief. They're going to be growing their life around grief, including their work. And so that checking in is really important. And it's not just for the first year. It's, it's as time goes on, because sometimes years 2 and 3 can be harder for somebody. And if I use the example, for me, 24 years on from the death of my son, I am still his mother and he is still my son. And it hasn't got easier. I've got better at living with it and coping with it. But actually, it's harder to say I haven't seen my son for 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months, then it's suddenly 6 years. That kind of gets harder, but that shouldn't be frightening for organizations. They're not going to open this can of worms that they're worried about. Actually, with the support and the checking in, and sometimes, as you said, having a grief ally, which they don't need training. It's somebody that's already maybe a close colleague and they're prepared to do it. They could have a scorecard, a virtual scorecard, and say, how are you doing today out of 10? And there may be an important meeting coming up and they're just a 4 on that day because there's been some awful admin they've had to deal with and it's triggered them. It's better to know that, and their colleagues can cover for them a bit in the meeting, and just have that knowledge and awareness. And then on another day, they might be a 10 unexpectedly because good things have happened and they're just adapting and things are good. A year later, there might be a setback. We live with it. We live with it forever. So this provision is gentle and ongoing, but it's not sort of catastrophic. It's not something that's going to cost a fortune. Unless, as Susanna's going to talk about in a while, they get into disordered grief because they haven't put the support in place. And then people are in a very dark place because they've been mask wearing and holding it in. And they haven't had that gentle support that's ongoing. So, there are so many actually comparatively easy ways of dealing with this in a very holistic, organic way as an organization, without spending a fortune and without opening the can of worms. But if you don't, then, it can lead to really, really, catastrophic behavior changes because somebody's had to hold it all in.
I think this is also one area where, employers, again, without cost really to themselves, is look at sabbaticals. And having unpaid sabbaticals available. And I think some people just, my experience is often people don't know that they can ask for these things, or they're too scared to ask for them because they think it's going to impact their long-term career prospects in terms of promotion, etc. But I mean, I think, certainly bereavement of a very close relative like a partner or a child, it seems to me that offering somebody the opportunity to perhaps have a year's sabbatical where the employer can still have the resource from the employee's salary to recruit someone on a fixed term contract or make arrangements, that of itself can be hugely beneficial, because I think there's so much that goes on that you maybe do need to change your life a little bit, don't you? And you need the time, you just need the time. But I don't see it being offered, to be honest with you, at all.
Yeah, and there's a lack of, as you say, a lack of awareness that people can ask for it, and something that Lizzie was discussing with me in the past was that each person deals with grief in a very individualistic way, and what one person may need is that complete break or time off work, and if they don't get the sabbatical, there will most likely be a loss of employment, because the things are just not, it's an essential part of their recoveries, having that time off work. Other people may benefit more from just getting on with work, but with the day-to-day support in place within the workplace, or the provision of counselling, or the help that Lizzie can provide as well on a one-to-one basis, those grief counselling sessions. And before we get on to Susanna's section, is there any, do you want to describe a little more about the specific work you do with companies, Lizzie, and individuals?
Yes, yes, and I think you're both absolutely right. I think that's such a brilliant suggestion of Susanna's, and Dean, you're right too, that it is about the individual. And I think I used to you an example of somebody in a law firm who was a partner and was fairly young partner and had young children and had been through a really terrible bereavement and had a house to clear and was really struggling. And their workplace phoned me up and said, we think that person probably needs a month off work, but we don't want to suggest it because we don't want to tip them off balance. And, there was this fear again of even having the conversation. And this is what needs to happen is, as you said, each individual needs to have the conversation. But again, we need to empower their managers and the HR teams with the right language to be able to have the conversation without fear. And actually what we organized through a couple of sessions was that various of their friends had offered to help. So I suggested that they take a day off every other week on a Friday, ask one of the friends to go and help clear the house with them, and they take one day off. So a number of friends just took one day off, and they were really happy to support. And this happened, and actually the month off actually became 6 days, having already had some compassionate leave, but this was ongoing through that year. And the team knew what they were dealing with and could cope for one day. The person concerned was not fearful of losing their job and letting their clients down. They loved their work, and that was the one thing they really wanted to keep in place. And they needed it financially because they had 3 young children. But again, not rocket science, that solution, but there was a fear around having that conversation. So, I think having good grief allies, having some one-to-one support in whatever way, but grief provision, not just a general therapist. They need to be, involved in the grief world, and there are many good people doing good work. Regular events around grief. I find panels are really good. I've been hosting a lot of panels for companies where I interview their staff about their own stories and what helped them and what didn't. So they're very positive events, and we live stream them and record them. And that way it's another bridge for people to access support without fear. It can sit on the intranet. And I think there's nothing more powerful than seeing your colleagues speaking about their own experiences to allow people to access without fear.
Great, thank you. And it's such a clear win-win, because if a little bit of time and resources, or financial resource as well, is invested at an early stage in helping people, you're avoiding a much more complex and costly, ultimately, exit or dismissal further down the line. And it really helps the individual and really helps the business and keep that stable, well-functioning team together as well. Yeah, and thanks so much. And yeah, really enjoyed your section. Thank you, Lizzie. Yeah, you do great work with companies and individuals. If you want to find out more about the great work that Lizzie does, check out her website. That's www.lizziepickering.com. So yeah, lizziepickering.com. And if anyone has any questions, of course, please feel free to use the Q&A box, and we'll pick those up at the end of the webinar. Just handing over now to Susanna, who's going to discuss prolonged grief disorder.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Lizzie. That was really useful and helpful. So I'm going to talk about, prolonged grief disorder, and I'm not sure how many of you have heard of it. It's often also referred to as grief disorder or grief reaction disorder. But it is something that we do need to be aware of. It's certainly not something where we see a lot of case law, but it doesn't mean that you might not one day find that you are in a situation where you have an employee who argues or puts forward a condition like grief disorder or prolonged grief disorder and says that they have a disability. So what I want to do is give you some guidance on how to deal with this in the workplace. So I first became aware of the concept of grief disorder when I was dealing quite some years ago with a redundancy case. I was acting for an individual at the time who'd been identified as redundant following a pooling and selection exercise. And he disputed his selection for redundancy and was claiming that he'd been unfairly dismissed. So his argument was that because the selection scoring criteria included a number of, and they were objective productivity criteria, but assessed over a 12-month period, he'd been disadvantaged because he was suffering from grief disorder. And he was arguing that grief disorder was a disability. And his situation was that his sibling had died a few months earlier. I can't recall exactly whether it was 6 or 8 months, but it was, in that 12-month assessment period that his employer had used. And he was arguing that his grief disorder had significantly impacted him and his work performance. So we tried to argue that the period of the assessment should have been for a longer period. We were saying it should have lasted 24 months, which would have then given the company a much more accurate and fair reflection of his actual performance. Now, in that particular case, the employer refused to do so, arguing that he didn't have a disability. And they were very, they weren't wrong, by the way, I think at that point in time that they were arguing it, but that was how they were resisting it. And I have to be honest with you, at the time, I remember feeling quite skeptical about it and whether or not this was something that we could really run, primarily because he hadn't been diagnosed by his GP with this condition. He'd actually been off work for quite some time over the period, but he'd been off with stress. And it had been put no higher than that, so it hadn't been put as depression. Actually, the employer then sort of really scuppered our argument, just to show you how it can also work against an employee, because when we did produce the 24 months period of performance, I mean, there was a clear indication that his performance had also been suffering for some time prior to his sibling's death. But I mean, that was how I first became aware of it. And actually, I mean, I thought it was a really interesting concept in terms of how an employee could suffer from symptoms or a condition arising from grief that could eventually spill into being classed as a disability. So that was probably in my world about 10 years ago. Roll on now to 2024. And prolonged grief disorder is now a much more recognised condition as a mental disorder. And it often occurs along with other mental disorders such as PTSD, anxiety, and depression, which are concepts that we certainly, for employers, that you are aware of and are more, what we know much more about it. So I guess my first point for you to note or take home is, do not assume, however, that you need to have a diagnosis of depression or PTSD for somebody who has prolonged grief diagnosis to be found to be disabled. In fact, they may not even have a medical assessment of it. And I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit more so you can understand how this is something you really do need to educate yourselves on, and why, you know, talking to people like Lizzie and embracing this in a much more positive, proactive way is long-term beneficial for you. So prolonged grief disorder was added in 2023 to the International Classification of Diseases on the 11th edition. And also it's been added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is actually a US publication, where they are much more, I think, attuned. So the US are much, much more attuned to this. And that's a publication that their medical professionals use for mental and psychological diagnosis. But what I'm saying, and why I'm emphasizing this, is that there is stuff out there that is being classed by medical professions that other people in the UK can rely on to support their medical condition or diagnosis. And from my perspective, I think it is now generally universally considered that it is a mental condition. It is a condition that can amount to a mental impairment. So how is it different from normal grief? Well, under the classifications that I've just talked to you about, it must be for a longer duration, and by that it must last 12 months or longer. It must exhibit in greater intensity or severity, and I'll talk to you about what some of that looks like. And it must impact on carrying out normal day-to-day activities. So not actually that dissimilar to the definition of disability under the Equality Act. For most people, the symptoms of grief begin to decrease over time. But for this small group of people who may end up having prolonged grief disorder, that intense grief persists, and the symptoms are severe enough to cause problems and stop them from effectively continuing with their lives. In particular, those individuals experience problems performing daily activities at home and at work, or both in work and home. And at that point, that's when you're seeing that it's tipping into becoming a disability. Some of the symptoms that have been identified as prolonged grief disorder include identity disruption, so such as feeling as though they're not part of themselves has died, long-term poor sleep, marked sense of disbelief about the death, so almost not really connecting with it, and I'm sure Lizzie would be able to talk and explain that in better language than myself. Certainly avoidance of reminders that the person is dead, intense emotional pain, and that exhibits itself often in anger, bitterness, and sorrow related to death. And then I think the thing that I probably have experienced in work where this has come up is perhaps with reintegration. So it's more about engaging with friends, pursuing interests, planning for the future. So often people become, they don't even want to come back to work, to be honest with you, just the concept of that, or going out and socializing with friends. So they isolate themselves, and that can be a key indicator for you as an employer. They talk about emotional numbness, feeling that life is meaningless, and feeling very much alone and detached from others. So you might find, again, in the workplace that you have individuals who become very closed off to their work colleagues. And I think Lizzie, again, sort of highlighted how, having a buddy or would help in those circumstances. So there are certain categories of individuals also that have been identified who might be at higher risk of suffering from prolonged grief disorder. And those are older adults who've had long-term relationships with partners, people with a history of depression or bipolar disorder, and also, interestingly, caregivers. So somebody who is being a long-term caregiver. So that's just to sort of put it into some perspective and to give you some knowledge about the condition. What I want to do next is to look at an employment tribunal case that went to the EAT called Mr. Igwiki and TSB Bank PLC. This was in 2019. And this dealt specifically, so as I said, there's not a lot of case law around this, but this case specifically dealt with the issue of grief and considered when a grief reaction is sufficiently severe and long-term to amount to disability. So Mr. Igwiki brought a claim because he'd not been awarded a bonus having received a low performance rating. And he claimed that his performance had been adversely affected by a grief reaction following the death of his father. And he again claimed that this amounted to a disability. It was his case that his grief reaction had affected his concentration, and that had impacted his performance at work, and that this led to the poor rating and the loss of the bonus, and therefore he'd been treated less favourably. He complained of a lack of assessment when he came back to work, of support from his workplace following the bereavement, and of the company's failure to make reasonable adjustments. And just like in my experienced case with the redundancy, TSB argued, amongst other things, that he was not disabled person within the meaning of the Equality Act at the relevant time. In this case, however, the tribunal didn't, they agreed, they didn't find that he was disabled, okay, as in with my case. And he appealed, and his grounds of appeal were that the tribunal erred by focusing on whether he was disabled by, as in depression, rather than by reference to him just having the adverse grief reaction. That they'd also erred in their approach to the impact on normal day-to-day activities by not viewing this in the context of his work, and in its approach to whether the substantial adverse effect, which it was said it should have found present, was long-term. The AT dismissed all grounds of appeal in his case. So you could say, well, that just shows that there's a case out there that will support us substantially if we need to, if we're ever faced with these circumstances. I don't think that's correct. I think what this case does, and I think it helpfully does it. So if you want to have a read of it, please ask me for the name or ask me for a copy and I'll send it to you. What it does is it seeks to remind us exactly of how we need to deal with these things and where we need to just make sure we don't fall into the traps. So the key questions are, did his grief reaction have a substantial adverse effect on his ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities? And if so, is this effect long-term, i.e., had it lasted 12 months or was it likely to last 12 months? And when we talk about a substantial effect from the legal perspective, this means it's got to be more than minor or trivial. And then it's also important for us to remind ourselves that the Commission for Equality and Human Rights issue codes of practice, which the tribunal will take into account. And in their code of practice, it states when we're considering what a substantial adverse effect is, that that account should also be taken of whether a person avoids doing things because it causes pain, fatigue, or substantial social embarrassment, or because of a loss of energy and motivation. Well, those are quite, those are quite wide. So somebody not being able to come back into the workplace or not being able to do certain things is something that you must consider. It also goes on to state that an impairment might not prevent someone from carrying out normal day-to-day activities. So clearly they can, but that when they do so, it causes them to suffer pain, or doing the activity causes them more than usual fatigue, as they may not be able to repeat the task. And I think one thing Lizzie didn't touch on with bereavement is the fact that people don't sleep. And they suffer from extreme fatigue, which just becomes all-consuming. So that is a big factor that I think an employer needs to take into account when dealing with someone who's suffering from bereavement. In the Igwiki case, the Employment Tribunal concluded that Mr. Igwiki was not a disabled person, and the reason for that was there was little evidence, medical or otherwise, and the emphasis, by the way, on this case was on the otherwise, that the death of his father had affected his work performance. They actually concluded that it might have had an impact on the quality of his work, but not on his performance. And they also found that, in fact, a lot of what he experienced was in many ways a typical reaction for the loss of a well-loved close relative. So I think what I wanted to highlight to you, and I could talk about this topic a lot actually, it's important that when you're considering grief and bereavement, and from my perspective, any mental health condition for that matter, so where Lizzie was talking about how grief could be experienced as you know, a massive impact from a divorce, for example, you know, it's really important that you as employers are aware of the following. To qualify as a mental impairment, it's not necessary for it to be a clinically well-recognized illness, nor is it a requirement that the claimant produces medical evidence, although clearly the existence of medical evidence is helpful and practical. And that's why when you're talking to any lawyer at Jones Chase, they'll be saying to you, have you got an OH report? Have you referred them to a OH? Are you meeting with the individual? Are you having welfare meetings with the individual? I mean, I think it's critical when we're looking at bereavement that you're offering support. I would suggest that should be in the form of counselling, or at least allowing them to access any EA program you've got in place. But again, those can be quite prescriptive. So it depends what you've signed up for as to whether you're going to get the right type of support and whether the person is trained perhaps to give grief support. And that's probably the key issue there. And then it's about considering adjustments, you know. So for me, it would be things like, you know, you've heard from Dom about how there's a very short period of time. So it's about allowing longer periods of time off work, perhaps reducing hours of work for a period of time, putting in support measures, thinking about things, thinking laterally, thinking about sabbaticals and that type of thing. For a condition to amount to an impairment that qualifies as a disability, it does not need a clinical label, nor is providing one indicative that it is conclusive. So what I want you to take home is that ultimately it's a matter for the tribunal looking at all of the evidence to decide whether or not the condition is a disability. So it's not what we label it or what they label it at. It's going to be an evidential assessment. Again, helpful, however, if you do have some medical evidence. And then perhaps the thing that's not so helpful for employees and is more helpful to employers as at this moment in time is that in most successful disability claims, disabled status has been established because the substantial adverse effects are found on normal day-to-day activities outside of work. This is because the definition of normal day-to-day activities has been traditionally interpreted in a fairly narrow way. And that's looking at more day-to-day activities like, you know, what you do on a day-to-day basis. And those are fairly basic activities outside of the workplace. So taking an example of the situation that might be relevant to a case of bereavement, there is a suggestion that an inability to concentrate on a task requiring application for several hours would not normally be regarded as having a substantial adverse effect on normal day-to-day activities, whereas persistent distractibility or difficulty concentrating would. And ultimately, as I said at the start, the impairment, the substantive effect needs to be more than minor or trivial. So I know I'm running out of time. In summary, our advice is that in dealing with anyone suffering from bereavement or grief, I mean, first of all, you need to know about it, because that obviously is a condition of disability anyways, that you have to have knowledge. But assuming that you do, you know, there is a requirement, I would suggest, on you to be compassionate and empathetic, to provide support, and where somebody is off because they're struggling to come back to work, rather than just dealing with it, as Dean identified, as long-term sickness, do get occupational health involved, but think laterally and outside of the box, and perhaps do things like offering grief counselling. And as I said, I could talk a lot more about this, but that probably is enough for now.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much, Susanna. And just very briefly for me as well, just I was going to ask you about reasonable adjustments, but you've already covered that. And just two quick things. And I didn't want to mention earlier, because maybe you were speaking about disability, but where a person does satisfy the legal test under the Equality Act as being disabled, I'm sure we all know, if an employer then dismisses them, if it's a long-term sickness case, because they're not in work, their absence is too much, that can trigger a discriminatory dismissal, a disability claim, which carries unlimited damages for the companies. It's very risky. And as Susanna's already mentioned, once a person is disabled, there's a statutory duty to make reasonable adjustments. And that is a very wide, nebulous concept. It can include, so many different things. Just before we wrap up, Lizzie, was there anything you wanted to add about Susanna's section, prolonged grief disorder? Or if not, don't worry, we'll wrap up now. Are you just on mute? Sorry, Lizzie.
On the point about the EA platforms that companies have, just as Susanna said, do check what the grief provision is when you're taking on any organisation to help with your EA work, because I hear from my clients that they've been given the support through a platform and through their work, and they've literally had somebody on the phone asking questions in a sort of box ticking way they've actually said, as Susanna said, I don't think they were trained, they were just asking questions off a sheet. Now, there are some very good, obviously, EA providers, but they have good mental health provision, but not always the grief. So do check that when you're taking on a new provider. And yes, you're right about sleep, Susanna. It's such an issue. But I get my clients going for hypnotherapy, and I get them meditating and doing yoga and all sorts of things in their own time to counteract those things and get them more sort of grounded in themselves. There's a lot that can be done.
Oh, fantastic. And I think we'll wrap up there just 1 minute before the hour. If anybody is interested in taking this forward within your organization, for example, to have a grief at work policy, to expand the compassionate leave policy, you have a parental bereavement policy, all of these things, of course, we can help with. Of course, Lizzie can do perhaps far more than what we can do with their employment support. She can actually help the individuals concerned themselves and the companies. And if anybody wants to find out more about what Lizzie does, again, check out her website, lizziepickering.com, LIZZIEPICKERING, and you can find out more there. And thanks so much for attending. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar, which will be about the new sexual harassment laws, which are coming into force this month, but we'll be speaking about it next month. And have a good afternoon, everyone. Take care. Thank you, and bye-bye.